There we go. All right, that was pretty easy. How's it going, everybody? This is Rusty here at FCP Euro, and today I'm going to show you how to replace the turbocharger on your 3-liter equipped vehicle, specifically on our B9 Audi S5. In front of me on the table, we do have the BorgWarner OE replacement turbocharger, along with the kit we've compiled with all the gaskets, seals, hardware, everything you're gonna need to go ahead and replace this turbo and make sure you're not missing anything. There actually may be a little bit much on this table, but it's always better to have everything you need should you have an issue down the road. With that, we'll also be draining the cooling system, and we'll be using the Xerox concentrate coolant, the HT12, which is specified for this vehicle. And we'll be doing an oil service at the end as well with the Liqui-Moly Top Tech 6200 020. The turbo housing is fairly large, and the downpipe is going to accommodate a lot of different turbochargers. So a lot of the repair that we're going to be performing today is going to apply to this factory unit, as well as many upgrades across the board. And we will also be doing a little bit of a mini DIY in the middle of this, where you actually have to take the turbo out to reseal the oil cooler that is on top of the hot-vee. So once we have the turbo out, we'll be going ahead and replacing the 4 oil cooler seals, and we'll have those seals linked in the description below because it's not necessarily part of this kit. However, in order to get those seals out, you do have to replace the turbo. So we're going to do a little preventative maintenance. Also making sure that we have a new filter in there. If there is a failure to the turbocharger, you may have some metal in between the fins of the filter. Definitely good to inspect that while going ahead and performing the service after replacing that turbocharger. So now that we've gone over everything on the table, let's get into some of the tools that we'll need to tackle the job. Now, if you're going to follow along in this video and try to do this procedure exactly as we are doing here today, you will probably need this or a similar kit, something with a very low profile bit driver with a small little ratcheting wrench, with a T30. This is going to give us a lot of extra clearance that we're going to need in order to perform the turbo replacement without having to take off a lot of the stuff, and you'll see why in a little bit here. With that, obviously a 1/4-inch wrench with a T30 would suffice, but it may not get into all the tight spaces that you'll need it to. A couple of extended T25 and T30 hex bits would be helpful as well. A variation of 3/8 and 1/4-inch extensions, whichever suits your needs at the moment. Definitely going to want a couple of flashlights. It is a little bit of a dark area. We're going to have a pocket screwdriver, a 90-degree pick. We'll need a 6mm Allen drive, a 10mm triple square, a T45, a T30. I have some couple of wrenches here. We'll be needing a 12mm, a 13mm wrench, and then I do have a 7/8, a 22, or a O2 sensor socket, whatever you can use to get that O2 sensor out of the turbocharger to give you a little more clearance. Not sure if we're going to need this, but I do have my indexing pry bar out, and that may help us try to pry up the oil cooler, which we're going to also be doing in this DIY. 3/8 ratchet, along with the 1/4-inch we spoke about, and a torque wrench. Now we have over here a couple of pairs of pliers. These spring clamp pliers may help us remove some of those V-bands. Otherwise, the hammer will help us release those with a screwdriver or a pocket screwdriver. We do have a carbide scraper here, which you'll see is a lifesaver in trying to remove some of the sealant. 7mm for some of your clamps, 12mm to accompany the 12mm wrench, as well as a 13mm, and you may want a couple variations of these sockets in deep, shallow, or mid-length. We also have a oil filter cap for the oil change we'll be performing later on, which is a 32mm socket. And you don't absolutely need this exact tool, but something with length, maybe a long pry bar. I have a long panel pry tool here. We're gonna need something to line up the oil drain into the engine block, because you're gonna be kind of fitting it all in at one time. I also have an impact drill, which is gonna make use of our time. It's not absolutely necessary, but it is certainly gonna be rather helpful. For filling up our coolant, we do have the U-View Airlift 2 coolant lift system, as well as a 5-gallon bucket to fill with coolant. And then as far as chemicals are concerned, we do have some brake clean, some glass cleaner, which I'll show you why in a little bit. And then I like to put my coolant connections back together with Vaseline. A Scotch-Brite pad will be helpful for cleaning up some of your connections. And then obviously some rags, drain buckets, and things like that are obviously going to be necessary. And that pretty much takes care of all the tools you're going to need for today's DIY. So let's go ahead and get into it. So before we get started up here, we are going to lift the vehicle up, get the belly pan off, and start draining the cooling system. I do want to mention that we do want to make sure the car is at a cool or warm to the touch temperature. Taking off the turbo, all those lines, that area around the turbocharger is going to be extremely hot, and we are going to be removing the catalytic converter, which is going to be somewhere between 2,000 degrees at running operating temperature. So Really want to make sure everything's pretty cool. You don't want to burn yourself. And before we get the car up, we are just going to crack the coolant reservoir, making sure that we get plenty of flow out of the cooling system. Coolant reservoir is located up in the cowl here, pulling up the little panel. And just like traditional Volkswagen Audi fashion, they take something that was perfectly fine before and they reinvent the wheel. So it's not a typical coolant cap. You do actually have to do a little extra work other than twisting it. So this little gray section here, you have to depress that with your thumb to release the coolant cap. And you may even have to catch that a couple times when you're making your way around. But once it starts to unthread, that cap or that little tab will disengage. You don't want to break that tab off there. That is the locking mechanism that makes sure that the coolant cap doesn't move. It looks like we are a little low on coolant to begin with, so that's pretty good. It's not going to have too much to drain. Now that we have the coolant cap removed, we'll go ahead and get the car up in the air. That's going to make sure that we have plenty of flow through the cooling system and making sure that we don't have any air bubbles and stuff when we go to refill. So let's get the car up in the air and start draining the coolant. So unfortunately for us, there's not actually like a drain valve or anything on this radiator. We will have to go ahead and release the lower radiator hose. There is a little wire clip that is inserted into the groove of the lower radiator hose, and we're going to use a small radiator pick. Could use a pocket screwdriver, but it is a little bit offset, so you may want something with a little bit of an angle. So we're just going to go ahead and pop that clip out of its groove, wiggle the hose off slightly, and I'm going to kind of control the amount of coolant that comes out of there to get to like a steady flow so I don't get doused in coolant. So get yourself a nice drain pan, something to catch all the coolant. And if these are fighting you, you could put a little bit of little foaming glass cleaner. Will work out some of the dirt and debris, and you certainly could go in there with some compressed air trying to get the dirt out of there if it is giving you a hard time. Making sure the clip is released, kind of just wiggle up and down using a little bit of force, but not too much because it is plastic. You can see it's starting to walk off slightly, and now the coolant's starting to drain out. It's probably going to go everywhere. Yep. All right, it's kind of gotten to a steadier flow, so I'm going to go try to find a little drain bucket so that we can move this larger drain bucket out of the way and get the car back down and let it drain down on the ground. All right, now that we have the coolant draining, we can go ahead and continue working while that's draining. I'm just going to remove the engine cover, get that off to the side, and then we're going to go ahead and remove the heat shield so we can gain access to the actual turbocharger. We're also going to have to take out some of the intake piping. We may even have to take out this radiator cover to get to some of the screws for this intake pipe, but let's start back here with the heat shield, exposing some of the sensors and a lot of the lines that we'll be accessing for the turbocharger. There's 413s for the engine cover to rest on for the grommets, but we are going to need a deep 13 millimeter clear the actual ball on the top of those. And on our car, we only have 3 of these currently, but we will be installing 4 upon reinstallation. So again, you should have 4. We were missing 1. That's what we're going to be replacing here. It looks fairly easy from here. However, there are a couple of screws that are a little bit difficult to get to down in the front. We're going to try to take this apart without taking out the radiator and removing the bumper and putting the car in a service position, but we'll see where that gets us. And we may be halfway through this video and have to dial it back a little bit. You can see there's a couple of screws for the front portion of the air charge pipes here. There's one down here that I can put my finger on, but I don't know if I'm going to be able to get a tool into there without giving us a little bit of extra room. So we'll cross that bridge when we get there, but I'm going to see if I can do this without taking off the front bumper. So let's get the air box out and get some more room on that side here. Get to the screws for the intake inlet. We are going to have to take off the radiator cover. We're just going to use a pocket screwdriver, pushing in the clip for the handle here, making sure that re-engages back there. And it is splined, so be careful when you go to reinstall that you don't have that misaligned. I'll pull up on the corners here and here, pulling this forward and out. You can see this screw is already partially out. We'll be replacing the intake down the road with a 034 carbon fiber intake, but this should normally be secured in there. It's a T25, I believe, and then we do have another one right there. All right, as I said before, this screw is pretty much loose, so that one's good to go, and that one will come out. That one's probably going to stay there because it's broken. Get that out of the way. Now, we're not necessarily going to have to remove the entire air box. It'll probably give us a little bit more room, but we can go ahead and just remove the piping here, and we're going to be taking off the turbo inlet here. It's a 7mm socket or a flathead screwdriver to remove these clamps. We're just gonna loosen them just enough so that they slide off, and we can take this pipe out. Making sure we don't lose that clamp. Put that off to the side. Now we're gonna start working on this charge air inlet. You can see we've got a lot of that harness in the way, so we'll start working some of that harness off. We're gonna get our PCV breather out of the way. We've got a lot of vacuum lines. Might not be a bad idea to take a picture of everything. For you guys, you'll be able to reference this video, but a lot of the stuff on this car may actually be routed incorrectly. I have a feeling somebody's been in here before, so don't take all of this routing for truancy, because again, somebody's definitely been in here. When we did the oil filter housing, we noticed that the vacuum line back here was not exactly secured correctly. So we will have to go back in there. I'm already starting to see some clamps back here that aren't really secured. So definitely do not take this for Bible. Take some pictures of yours, compare it to ours, and find the best map of your vacuum lines, your harness, and things like that. So take a good note before you start taking everything apart. Don't just start ripping on hoses, and yeah, just make sure everything goes back to where it was when you started. So we're going to take off this PCV breather kit here. Ours is the upgraded kit from 034 Motorsport, and it does have these little tangs here, just like factory. Go ahead and remove those. Go ahead and remove these. That'll give us some room there. This lower one is a little tight down there. I'm going to try to get it out with a pick. All right, there we go. We're going to take our PCV breather kit and put that off to the side as well. So we're obviously not going to be taking this engine harness completely off. It's probably going to rest in this similar position, but it does have a series of zip tie little clips, and you kind of have to open them up slightly when you pull up on them. Careful not to break them. You can always put the zip tie back on. You can see this one, the zip tie is missing. So we're just going to kind of loosen this up. Another one right here. This one we'll probably remove the connector for, so we don't worry about damaging that. It'll also give us a little bit more room to keep things moving. This connector on ours is actually broken, going to the diverter valve. Just slide that off nicely, but you should have a little black tab right there. That'll help release that. We are gonna have to take out the evap line. That should not be that easy to remove. We do have a new connector for that later on, but that should have another tab as well. You should be able to firmly press that tab and remove that evap line. So we will have to loosen up some more of this line before taking that line all the way out. And just like the PCV breather, this evap line does have a little squeeze clamp right here you can go ahead and take out. There is one T30 down here that we will have to remove to get this entire line loosened up and out of our way. So I'm gonna grab a T30 bit and we'll get to that in a second here. So if that doesn't come off, you may want to use a small pocket screwdriver or even a pick to get under that vacuum line. Obviously be careful when you're using a pick not to tear this vacuum line because it is rubber. So I'm just going to use a screwdriver at the very end, using that to push off. We're just going to tip that backwards towards the other way, making sure we still have plenty of room. Now I'm going to free up the evap line back here. This is where the solenoid's located. There's a connector underneath the purge valve. It's also broken. Wow, somebody really did a number on this sport car. Once you get the evap line loose, it's just kind of pressed onto this bracket right here. You just kind of wiggle it up and off that bracket. You don't have to disconnect any of the hoses or anything, but the connector that we were just talking about is broken as well. We're gonna go through and replace a couple of these connectors. Disengage the fuel line right here. This will give us a little bit more slack on that line. I'm just gonna put this line up on the cowl here. So we don't wanna mess with this if we don't have to. So let that rest up here. That should be out of our way plenty. The next thing we're gonna try to get off is this turbo air inlet right here. We do have plenty of room to get to the top T30. The lower T30 is just behind the charge air cooler pipe here. That's going to be a little bit more difficult. We may need to get in there with a wobble T30, or I might even be able to get in there with a Torx screwdriver. So we're going to try to get that lower bolt first and see if we can save you guys some more time. So we're definitely not going to be able to get in there with a Torx bit or something. What we're going to have to use is something like this. This is a small half-cut Torx bit. Bit itself is quite small. You can certainly use something like this with a 1/4-inch ratchet if you don't have one of these small little bit ratchets, which are very handy to have, especially working on one of these. I'm going to try to get that bottom one loose first, securing that bit in there and pushing on the back with my hand. Oh yeah, that was a little tight. So once you get that loose, you can probably get down there by hand and finish loosening that nut up, bolt up, whatever it is. All right, that one's almost out. I'm going to continue on to this top one, and we'll see if we can take them both out together. The bolts will not come all the way out. You will have to take them out with this flange itself. Another part of the reason why they have you remove that whole charge air pipe just to get that one torque screw is there is another hose down here. I might be able to grab it with my fingers. It is a little awkward. Try and get it from both sides. There we go. So I did have to use a finger on the front and back to get that to loosen up, but main purpose of this was the T30 at the bottom is somewhat submerged in there. In order to correctly get on there and make sure that you don't have any issues getting it in and out, they do want you to take out this entire Y pipe. With that, there is one more T30 underneath here, and if I recall, there is one more. If I use the eyes on the tips of my fingers, there is one more at the bottom of that pipe, which we can show you on the actual turbocharger. Now what we're looking at, this is the section that we just took off here. The next pipe that we actually needed to loosen up, we're not going to actually get that all the way out. We're hoping to get the turbocharger out and leaving that section right there. This screw we can get to, which we can see from up top. The one on the very bottom is going to be extremely difficult. Again, you're going to have to use the eyes on the tips of your fingers to kind of find where that actually is. But referencing the new turbo on your bench should be very helpful. All right, now that we got that out of the way, we are going to try to do this similar thing on the lower charge air pipe. There is a T30 that is somewhat visible from up here with a fairly brittle coolant line in our way. We're going to try to get that lower bolt first, which again, as I was saying earlier, you kind of have to feel around for. You can see it next to the oil filter housing, but it's definitely in a spot you do not want to strip that. So make sure you have a good bit, and I'm going to be using a small bit driver ratchet with a little 3-inch T30 from the bit driver set that I have. Once you know you're securely in that T30, break that free. All right, on this next T30 here, we do want to be very careful of this little coolant line here. They are very brittle. I don't know what kind of plastic they're made out of or what Audi was thinking when they were using coolant, plastic for coolant lines, but be very careful when you're actually cracking that free. You want to make sure you don't stress that coolant line. We're going to be using that same bit ratchet I used on the upper turbo inlet. I think we got it. All right, we got that charge pipe loose. We'll go ahead and replace that O-ring on that pipe once the turbo is out. Obviously, if we got that pipe out of the way, it would definitely be a lot easier, but this is going to save you from having to remove the fans, remove the radiator support into service position. So once those two are out of the way, we can pretty much tackle everything else up on top. So we are going to continue on removing the O2 sensors, getting the catalytic converter off to the back, and then we can continue getting our oil lines off, and we're almost there, quite honestly. But that little trick right there saves a lot of headache and a lot of components from having to come off and potentially be damaged on removal. So this hopefully is going to be a helpful trick for everybody at home, and we're going to keep going here. So the evap line, little cover here, heat wrap if you will, is usually in this poor condition. The snaps like to rip off. We'll do our best to kind of reattach that later on or hopefully replace that. We do want to get the O2 sensor out. We don't necessarily have to get out the rear O2 sensor, but if we're going to be moving this catalytic converter around, we may want to get that out so that we don't damage that. Mainly want to get the one out of the turbo. The connector runs all the way down and on the other side. We can certainly remove the O2 sensor and spin the wire out, putting it off to the side, but if you want to take the wire out completely or install a new O2 sensor at the time of putting the turbocharger in, you will have to take the air box out to get down to that connector on the passenger side cylinder head. So we're going to use a 7/8 wrench. If you find the 7/8 wrench or a 22mm wrench is difficult to get out and it's starting to round that, you may want to get an oxygen sensor socket, and we do offer plenty of those at fcpeuro.com. So I'm going to be using just an open-ended wrench. I think we had this off once before. We're going to spin this out, and I'm going to grab a rag. Just gonna wrap this in a rag, keep it from getting damaged while it's sitting out of the car. Take it out of this loom here, and we'll just place it right there. We're gonna start working on this clamp next. I don't think we're gonna have to get that out of the way, but we'll get the clamp off and we'll see where that catalytic converter lands. So let's do that. Make sure that you don't strip this T30 out. It's not very tight. It's just holding the two pieces together, and there's a gasket in there that seals it. So this thing does not have to be super, super tight, but we wanna make sure we get firmly seated in there. And then a lot of times with these V-bands, you may have to give it a little bump, and that one did not do the trick. So let's get a small hammer and a screwdriver. Once that clamp is loosened up, you can get it out of the V-band itself, and we can just kind of slide it into the back until we get the turbo out and worry about that later. So once you've got that clamp off, we can just go ahead and remove that. We are going to be replacing that, and we don't want to forget that on the downpipe. We'll set that off over here. Give the whole catalytic converter a little bit of a push, making sure that the V-band is detached from the actual turbocharger. Now we've got our charge air inlet and our exhaust removed. The only thing that is holding the turbo down, other than the oil lines, is the exhaust manifolds into the cylinder heads. So with that, we'll go ahead and start taking out some of these oil lines. And I just wanted to point out that you can certainly remove the oil cap and allow for a little bit more room, but you do not want to leave that oil cap uncovered. And I've left it in for as long as we can. If I have to take the oil cap off to get the turbo out to give myself some clearance, I'll certainly do that, but I do want to make sure that we don't let any metal in there. Even though we're going to be doing an oil service after the turbo replacement, you really want to make sure that you keep any contaminants from getting in there. We've already drained the coolant. There's definitely going to be some oil coming out of those, so I'll have a rag ready when we get this one that goes out into the oil filter housing, and I'll try to tip that down and out of the way, keeping it out of our way here. So let me grab another rag. It's a T30 in all of the oil lines and coolant lines, and there's one from underneath that we're not going to be able to get out until we actually get the turbo out on the bench. So we're going to take this T30 out of here. I'm just going to try to soak some of this up so it doesn't make a mess when we take this out. Obviously, if you were reusing the turbocharger, you wouldn't want to be using one of these style rags, getting some of this red fuzz in there. You probably want to use a lint-free cloth and make sure to cap off all these fittings when you're taking it off. But with us replacing it, we're not too concerned with that. Making sure this is nice and clean. So I just grabbed one of the little caps that would be in the turbocharger. I'm going to use that to keep our oil line covered. So your new turbo does come with some handy little tools there. Keep this line out of our way and not stress it too much. I'm just going to bungee cord this up here. Now we're going to go ahead and work on the coolant lines. You have one over here and one over here. I'm going to try to get this one out of our way first. It does have a flexible section down here. However, I'm not sure if we're going to be able to get that past the wastegate. We may need to kind of manipulate that down and away and kind of play with it while we're getting the turbo out. It may not actually come out of here. You certainly could go ahead and remove the other end of that from the cylinder head, allowing a little bit more play, but we're going to try to keep from having that out of there and have to replace that seal. So we're not going to worry about that one. Let's go ahead and get the other line off. I would like to take a second to note that the screw that we took out of the line on the driver's side of the turbocharger, as well as the oil line and the coolant line that we just took off, is slightly shorter. So keep that in mind when you're going back together. The one on the driver's side of the turbocharger with the line that is difficult to get past the wastegate has the shorter bolt. I'm going to try and do the same thing we did over here. On this particular vehicle, someone's obviously been in here, as we were saying before, and this bracket in the back has been removed. There's probably a T30 that's supposed to be there. You may find that removing that T30 allows a little bit more flex with that line. But again, someone's already taken that out and done us a favor, so we'll be sure to put one back in when going back together. I'm gonna get my little forked panel tool under here. Careful not to bend that flange too much. Working the line and prying on the actual fitting will be very helpful. Wow, you can see there's some corrosion in there. All right, now that we've got all of our oil lines off, with the exception of the one oil drain in the bottom that will not come out until we get the turbo out, we are gonna start working on the manifold hardware on either side here. We're also gonna loosen up this V-band clamp that goes to the driver's side cylinder head. pretty sure we're not going to have to take off the flange nuts at the bottom. It's just going to be these triple squares, but we'll find out here in a second. It is the same size triple square as the manifold hardware. All right, I'm going to go over to the other side and get those loosened up. Turbo's loosened up, so we're going to go ahead and take this V-band all the way out. This will give us just enough room to get this turbo out with a little bit of finagling we'll have to do. So right at about this point, you'll notice that there's a little bit of tension when you're trying to pull up on the turbo. You're going to be fighting the charged air inlet that we didn't take all the way out, as well as the catalytic converter. And as I've been saying this whole time, there is one more oil drain tube at the very bottom. I'll show you that here in a second once I get this all the way out. So you'll notice this oil drain stays into the cylinder head here. The bottom of the turbo obviously has to drain the oil and has to go somewhere. The manufacturer has used a small little plastic clip to actually secure that in there. Removal is a lot easier than reinstallation. So when we go to put this back in there, we're going to suggest a new one of these, which should be in the kit, as well as a little bit of lubricant on the bottom fitting there. And you're going to have to kind of work that fitting into place. So keep an eye on how this is orientated into the engine here, and we're going to try to replicate that when we're putting that back in there. It is indexed slightly, so it shouldn't be terribly out of place, but just be mindful that that will give you a little bit of a hard time coming out, and probably even more of a hard time going back in. And now that we've got the turbocharger out of here, we can start cleaning up some of the oil that we had an issue with when we did the oil filter housing. There's a lot down there, as well as resealing that oil cooler. So we're going to take a break here and start cleaning this up, and we'll be right back with you guys when we go get ready to reinstall that turbo. So before we start spraying any brake clean or any compressed air, we do want to seal off some of the stuff. As you see, I've used one of the caps from the turbo to seal off this little stand here. I'm going to use a little bit of tape on the gasket on the passenger side, and I have one of the little bungs stuck into the oil drain here. Just make sure that you don't have any open orifices, because you don't want to introduce any brake clean where it shouldn't go. Also, you don't want to blow any of this debris into any of the openings. We want to make sure that the cat is nice and clean. So we're going to obviously cover that up with some tape, and there's not a large enough cover for that, although the rear cover on the turbo may fit. Let me see if that fits. Now we can go ahead and brake clean the heck out of this thing. I am going to find one more cap for that inlet, as well as this line here. So obviously the bungs from the kit will work, some tape will work, or whatever you have available. Anything else, just move it out of the way and make sure that you don't get any brake clean or anything like that in there. And just do a double check to make sure everything is sealed off, and we should be good to go. One thing to keep in mind as we are brake cleaning this off, you're going to want a couple of belly pans, or we have some cardboard here on the floor, because the brake clean will go out through various drains in the cylinder head area here, and you're not really going to be able to trace it. So make sure you've got a couple of drain pans or something to catch all the brake clean and stuff that's going to go through there, and just do the best you can. If you're not going ahead and replacing that oil cooler, after this you're ready to start reassembly. But again, we're going to clean it up, and we're going to replace the oil cooler seals. We'll probably have to clean it up again because some of that oil is going to wick out, but we're just going to do the best that we can before taking that oil cooler out to get a lot of this debris out of this area. So we just wanted to take a second to kind of show you something here. We've had an oil leak on this car previously. We did take care of the oil filter housing, and that's why we're going after the oil cooler, because there's still potential of an oil leak. We've noticed on the backside of the car, when you're underneath, it looks like the rear main seal is leaking. When you look down here where this part number is on the block, just behind that is where the transmission starts. So any oil that is up in this area makes its way past this little threshold here and touches that transmission flange. It will wick down past the transmission, making it look like a rear main seal is leaking, but more often than not, you actually have a leak from up above that is trailing down. So if you are seeing some oil in the back of the vehicle, in the transmission to engine area where they both mate underneath the car, you may want to take a look up here, looking down and underneath the catalytic converter, kind of seeing if this area is wicking with oil, moist, or kind of like coated in oil like ours is here. So it's just something to keep in mind before you take everything apart as you may want to consider doing the oil cooler here like we are today. All right, I'm gonna take a minute here and really try to thoroughly clean this up, blow some air down there, maybe even use a vacuum, and probably a couple cans of brake clean. So we won't bore you guys with this. Everyone knows how to clean up an engine bay. So we went ahead and brake cleaned everything off and tried to scrape out some of the dirt. Once we get the oil cooler out, I'll show you a couple of the drains that are in the back corners here, which is when you do have an oil leak from the oil filter housing or the oil cooler, that's where you'll see the oil coming out of, and it will kind of make it look like you have all these random oil leaks throughout the motor underneath. So one thing to keep in mind, if you do have any oil leaks, it's most likely the oil filter housing, but then it could also be the oil cooler that we'll get into here in a second. Just so I can get a little bit more clearance to get onto some of these T30s back here and also remove this breather line back here, I am going to go ahead and get some of these brackets out for the turbo manifolds. And also we will have to get the bottom ones out because the gaskets are actually pinched. Although they don't have holes that go through there, they are pinched into that bracket. So in order to get the gaskets out, we do have to remove those lower portions. So I'm just going to put this off to the side now, and we'll start working on these upper studs here. On the upper studs, there is a T25 in the very top. It's most likely for installation purposes, but I'm going to give it a shot for removal. If you have a difficulty removing this, you may want to use a double nut method where you put two nuts together, sandwich them, and then use the lower nut to kind of extract that stud. Otherwise, there are stud extraction sockets that we could probably use as well. So we'll start with the T25 and see if we can get this going. You don't want to just go after it. You kind of want to rock it a little bit and see if you can get it to break free. And actually we got lucky there. So you'll notice I didn't like just go after it. That may strip the T25 on the top, but if you just gently rock it back and forth until that breaks free, you're more than likely going to be able to use that T25 at the top. Now that we got all those studs out, we are going to proceed with the lower brackets with the copper nuts. They do look like a 13, which is generally what most nuts on a Volkswagen Audi vehicle are. However, these are actually a 12, so don't be fooled. They are one of the few bolts on the car or nuts on the car that do not make sense, if you will. They're slightly smaller than what you'd expect. I'm just gonna vacuum again real quick because once we did take those studs out, you'll see there's a little bit of debris from where the studs came into the cylinder head, and we just wanna make sure that none of that metal shavings gets in anywhere. All right, we vacuumed most of the debris up and around that area. I just wanna kind of clean up the sealing surface before we go ahead and throw some tape back over this before we get that oil cooler out. So I've got a little brake clean on a Scotch-Brite pad, just lightly scuffing the surface to take off any excess dirt, and then I'll run over it with a rag, and then I'll throw some tape on that. So I was trying to use the exhaust nuts, and obviously they are lock nuts, so they have a little bit of a cinch to the top of them, making it a little bit difficult to get them on the studs. So when I was removing the clamp on the driver's side exhaust manifold stand, if you will, the nut did come off the back. So luckily for us, that is the same thread. So if you take the nut off of your old clamp and put that one down first, use the exhaust nut on top of that, and then we're going to take that lower nut and pull it up towards that top exhaust nut, locking the two together using that lower nut to extract a stud. All right, now that we have that one exhaust stud out, you can go ahead and vacuum up any metal shavings that may have come out. Hopefully not too many, but we're going to go ahead and just break these two free using the 13 and the 12 again. Kind of counter holding those, and then that loosens everything up, and we can go ahead and replace that stud. We can use that same method for installation. We do want to be careful not to tighten those up too much, stretching that stud. The whole purpose of this is ideally so that we can make sure that we meet the proper torque spec with the new hardware. It would be a shame if you were to tighten that down, try to meet that torque spec, and snap one of these studs off in the cylinder head. That would probably result in drilling, tapping, and rethreading and some extraction. So we are trying to alleviate that, make that the easiest process possible. But let's go ahead and get the other three studs out, and we'll catch up with you guys in a second for the oil cooler. All right, so unfortunately, this is a one-time use connection. There's no actual way to open this up. I was trying to get in there and pull these clips up with a 90-degree pick, trying to get in there and open these up, or even using this indexing pry bar here to try to pry up on the sides to open that up. And quite honestly, once that's installed, it's pretty much in there for the life of the car. And I did damage it slightly on the way out. One of my suggestions, if you are going through with this oil cooler, try to work around that one T30 that is directly underneath this hose, getting that one out and maybe removing the oil cooler with this assembly attached. We're gonna have to go ahead and replace this because that's gonna be under the turbo. And with that, just like the oil cooler seals that we'll be replacing here in a moment, we will have the link to this component here in the description down below. So now that we have this off, I'm actually gonna take this cap and put it on with the connection we just took off. Just gonna stick that down in there so that we don't get anything in that oil cooler. And now that I got that line out, I can actually get in here and clean out a lot more of the dirt and debris. I really couldn't get a vacuum down underneath here with the bracket and all there. So we are gonna go ahead and just clean this up a little bit more, because when we take that oil cooler out, there's probably gonna be a little bit of oil that spills out. There's gonna be some coolant, and we do wanna try to make sure that we don't mix any of that debris and get that back into the engine oil. You can see there's a small drain in here. We are gonna wanna make sure that drain is clear, as well as one more in the back corner over here, and we'll show you that in a second. You can see there's another one back here in the corner underneath the passenger side cylinder head, behind that oil cooler. Again, we wanna make sure these are clean and clear, because there is gonna be some liquid coming out of this oil cooler when we lift that up. And if I recall, I think there's another one somewhere in here. Now that we have everything cleaned as much as we possibly can with everything we have here today, we're gonna go ahead and start removing some of these bolts. But first, there is a little wire harness in front here that we are gonna have to either move out of the way, or actually if we just tuck that up over the filter housing, that should be good there. But there's a series of T30s that go around the outside here. I'm just gonna pop those all out, and then hopefully that oil cooler will lift up. We'll get the oil cooler serviced, get those seals in there, and we'll start reinstalling all that, going back to the turbo reinstallation. So let's get these little T30s out of here. When I was cleaning this earlier, I did happen to notice a little bit of RTV. So let's see if somebody's already been in here once before, and that's why it's so sticky. Ah, I was right. Somebody else in here. So you're not supposed to see that. You're not supposed to have any RTV in this area. Ideally, you don't want any sealant in that vicinity, but this was more than likely leaking once before, and somebody had an issue with this. So we're gonna go ahead and try and suck out some of that. Obviously, we are mixing oil and coolant, so we are gonna wanna do our oil service after this, but I don't believe you're supposed to have any sealant in that area. All right, once we have everything cleaned up, we do still have the vacuum there because we do have to scrape up a little bit of the sealant. And while I scrape it, I'm gonna have the vacuum on to make sure that none of the pieces of RTV or sealant fall into any of those coolant galleys, hoping that the vacuum will suck them up as I scrape them off. But before we get into that, we're gonna come over to my bench here and talk about the oil cooler itself. You can see someone has actually, had some scrape marks on here, which I believe somebody has already resealed this once before. Also, this does not look very factory. The fact that the RTV has kind of pressed out, and you can see there's a lot of extra that I had peeled off. And I had mentioned earlier in the video that while we were cleaning it up previously, there was a little bit of RTV that had squeezed out on the corners. You should really have a small, about 3mm wide bead when we go to install that. So we don't want to have a lot of sealant squeezing out of that can get into the breather assembly and kind of get tossed throughout the rest of the engine. So when we go back to resealing that, we do want to be very careful not to put too much sealant in that area. But we're just going to use this carbide scraper here and clean up the little bit of sealant on there. You can certainly use some Scotch-Brite pad or something similar, but you don't want to gouge this aluminum. So we want to make sure that we do still have a nice sealing surface. Obviously the RTV will fill in any deep gaps, but we want to be sure that we don't go too deep into this aluminum. There are a couple of little dowels here you want to make sure that you don't remove when you're sanding it. So if you're using like a small die grinder, air powered or electric, you really want to be careful not to grind down those dowels, because they are going to locate the cooler in there, aside from actually locating it with the bolts. So we're just going to start using this little scraper here. This is going to make sure that we don't remove any of the excess aluminum. All right, once you get that cleaned up, you're going to want to flip it over and let it drain out. Make sure that there's no fluid left over in there. tap it out, make sure there's none of that RTV in there. And I can see a little piece right there, but we just want to make sure that this is drained before we go ahead and reinstall that. So I'm going to leave that sitting like that, making sure there's no fluid coming out. You really want to make sure that there's nothing coming out of that, because when you go to reinstall that, any of that fluid gets on that RTV that we're going to put down here. It's definitely going to cause a issue with sealing that. So before we go ahead and start scraping that, I am going to remove the 4 O-rings that seal the oil cooler coolant and oil down there. So you're just going to take a pick and get into the edge there, and that should pop the seal out just like that. And now do that on all 4. So unfortunately it's going to get a little loud here. I'm going to try to do this scraping with the vacuum to make sure that we don't get any of the remnants of that RTV into any of the coolant or oil jackets. So certainly could block them up with some paper towel, but that also might get sucked up in the vacuum. But I'm going to make a couple of little paper towel wads and just hopefully prevent anything from getting down there. Well, somebody got a little heavy-handed with the RTV, so I'm going to go ahead and clean this off camera, and we'll catch up with you guys in a second here. All right, once you're satisfied with the cleanliness of your oil cooler area as well as the hot-vee, you better be satisfied, because this is probably the last time you're going to be in here for quite some time. We do have 4 of these little O-rings. We're just going to press into the oil cooler holes, or bores, whatever you want to call them, and they definitely fit a lot better. You can actually see and feel that they protrude off of that stand a little bit. The old ones that were in there may have been reused. Obviously, we saw someone has been in there previously and sealed them, because that was definitely not computer in the factory laying that sealant. It was definitely a little bit sloppy. All right, once you've cleaned up everything and you're happy with how it all looks, and you've cleaned out all the threads where the bolts go in, we are going to start applying some sealant. One thing to keep in mind when you're applying this sealant is have everything else ready to go. Have all your bolts ready, have your cooler ready, have the seals already installed. We are going to be applying the sealant onto the engine block, but we do want to make sure that within about 5 minutes we're installing that and we're fastening the bolts, because that is going to start to dry. Another thing to keep in mind, all the factory sealants do have an expiration date on them. This one is a couple months from being expired, so just keep that in mind before you open this up, and make sure that you don't have an expired sealant. And again, you do want to make sure you've had your oil cooler draining for quite some time, because you are going to be flipping that over and installing that on there, and possibly disrupting some of that sealant with some oil or coolant could contaminate that seal. So let's go ahead and just give it a once over, make sure everything's clean and clear, nothing's in the way, and go ahead and drop your cooler in place and get ready to put your bolts in as soon as possible. All right. Once we have all the hardware in there and sunk into the oil filter housing, we're going to go ahead and torque the bolts to 9 Newton meters. Now, there's no actual pattern in which you should be torquing them, but we are going to do this in a diagonal pattern. So I've already used a hand tool to bring them back down to the base, so this shouldn't be too many turns of the torque wrench. All right, the oil cooler is now resecured, resealed. Everything should be good there, and we did go ahead and torque it to spec. I understand not everyone's going to have a 9 Newton meter capable torque wrench, especially not one that's going to fit into the palm of your hand. This may be able to even be found at a bike shop or something. It is a very small, inexpensive torque wrench, but with it being so far in here and having to take the turbo out, we really want to make sure that we're precise. You could certainly snap one of those little T30s off if you over tighten it. So be mindful if you aren't using a torque wrench, and just snug them up by hand. Again, 9 Newton meters is not very much. All right, if you guys recall, we did have a little bit of a struggle removing this vacuum line. Luckily for us, we are here at FCP Euro, and we do actually supply this line, so we were able to go pull it off the shelf. And again, we will have this in the drop-down menu below, but I will make a suggestion. If you're able to get the oil cooler out without taking this off, definitely do so. You can take it off from these 2 lines. It will be a little bit difficult on that one T30 that's underneath there, and obviously getting it out of this area will be difficult with the hose attached. However, it will probably save you a few pennies and a potential issue. So we're gonna get rid of that one, and I have a new one right here. Oh, look at that. It's even got the nice little heat wrap on there that ours was missing. So, and obviously with us being down this far, there are some check valves and plastic line that could fail. So it may be a good idea to just go ahead and replace this if you're down in that area anyway. just verify the routing on your evap line, but breather line here. And before you secure that like I just did, make sure you have everything in place, because once you secure that, it's probably not coming off. So again, I've certainly been lucky previously and been able to remove that line, but I do advise either having a spare line ready or not taking it off the oil cooler if you're going into this area. So just verify that all of your routing is correct before you secure that. I've secured it down here as well, making sure you're not pinching any harnesses or putting that line in a place where the turbo might actually obstruct it. Now the next step, before we continue here, we are going to go ahead and replace this coolant line as well as the oil drain, and we're going to go back and install those manifold studs that we removed earlier. If you guys recall from earlier, when we were removing the turbo lines, we did notice that one of the brackets was loose. So I did go grab a spare T30, and I'm just going to reinstall that line before we get too far ahead. I will be using that to kind of secure that in place so that I can remove this coolant line. Not really sure what the reasoning is behind it. However, when you replace the turbo, it is required to replace this coolant line. It may become deformed with heat, whatever. The manufacturer says it is a mandatory replacement hose, so we're going to follow suit. Now we kind of have to dissect this heat shielding a little bit. If you look at the new hose does have some new corrugated covering on it, so you want to be careful not to destroy too much of that, as we are going to have to reuse a little bit of this. So we're going to try to carefully open this back up and see if we can reuse some of this. But this does elongate a little bit, so once you do get this on, we can kind of slide that in place. I'm not going to do that right now because it'll probably make it very difficult to get this back on. So once you get this in, this will expand and we'll cover everything up again. So as you saw, we were quickly replacing the studs on the driver's side bank. We're going to show you in a little bit further detail on the passenger side. I'm just going to go ahead and remove this tape and we'll start installing those studs. So just like removal, we did the double nut method where we tighten the two nuts together to remove the stud. However, we're going to use that same method for installation. I've already fixed the two nuts together and we'll show you that on the next one as well. See, they're actually already starting to loosen up. So we are going to throw the 13 that we used from the exhaust V-band clamp and a 12 to tighten that nut. And then we're going to try to get that torque down to 15 Newton meters. And you may notice that when we get close, the nut may break away. So we may have to counter hold this to lock that back down. Now we've got our new studs in. We are ready to lay our gasket on. So you'll notice that when you just kind of lay it in place, it doesn't sit exactly in a perfect position for the exhaust bore. So we will need to kind of hold that in place. Actually, we are going to put it this way, kind of using the witness mark from the previous gasket as a reminder, but that's kind of where that was sitting. So we'll keep that in place while we rest that bracket on there and then tighten those two 12mm nuts at the bottom. All right, now we're ready to go ahead and torque those fasteners. It is, again, a 12mm nut, and we're going to be torquing these to 30 Newton meters. Now we can go back and finish tightening up these upper studs. All right. And you'll notice while I was torquing those, I did have my thumb firmly planted on the top of the wrench, just making sure that that T25 was securely seated in there. When you get to that final torque spec, it does start to get a little at an angle, if you will, but it's definitely pushing it to its limit. So be careful on reinstalling those with that T25. Now we're ready to go take this oil drain line out, and there's definitely a little dirt and debris in there. We want to make sure it's clean, but we don't want to push any of that dirt down in there. So kind of take a rag around your finger maybe and pull up and out to get anything out of there. It looks pretty good, nice clean bore. We did a good job cleaning that up around that area. So now we're ready to start installing our turbo. We will have to install this stand just loosely. We don't want to install this all the way. So I am going to just put this back in place with the cap removed. And that just kind of sits in that groove. One thing to keep in mind when you're going to put the turbo in, we are going to have to manipulate these lines a little bit. You could certainly remove this line and make it a little bit easier, but we did not do that, so we did not have to worry about replacing that seal. it's obviously doable. And we are going to have to replace the gasket on this front charge air pipe as well. So we are going to take the cap out of here. I'm going to get a pick in the corner here and replace that charge air gasket. There's a little indent in the top here where you can kind of insert a screwdriver or a pick and try to get behind it, going down and around and making sure we get that whole gasket out in one piece. So we're going to go ahead and match that up to the gaskets in our kit, and we'll get ready to install that. So the kit does come with 2 of these gaskets. However, we did not remove the other end of that. So we will just be replacing the upper end of this gasket and just kind of fit it into the groove, similar to how it was removed. My favorite instruction in most manufacturer instructions is reinstallation is the same as removal. Not always. All right, how we struggle to get that seal in there. As you saw, you do need a little bit of patience. You want to make sure it is securely fitted in there, because we are going to be kind of improperly installing it, if you will, but a little cheat never hurt anybody. So make sure that seal is firmly in place. Make sure your routing of your lines are in place. All right, now before we go ahead and drop this turbo in there, we do have to do a little bit of reassembly. There are a couple of components that we'll have to either swap over and or install as a new component in the new turbocharger. So some assembly required. It's not just a direct replacement. So follow me over to the bench and we'll talk about that here in a second.